Well, thanks Ian for the invitation. I'm glad there are still some people here. I am an international lawyer, so I intend to approach the Belt and Road from the perspective of international law. I personally have a very strong interest in the interdisciplinary study of international law and international relations. So this is also part of my broader project on the impact of the rise of China on international law and international order in general. In particular, my project looks at what kind of change the rise of China will bring to international law and accordingly to the international order that has been sustained by the contemporary system of international law. On this specific project on the Belt and Road, this paper it has already been written. It looks at whether the Belt and Road will make China an international rule maker, and in turn, if China is able to produce a different system of rules, different set of rules, will it overthrow the international order? So my basic argument is based on a study, preliminary. Sorry.
A bit louder.
Okay, so does this work? Okay, it does work. Okay, so yeah. Next. So this paper is to address a very important concern, which I have heard from or read from the work of my friends in the area of international relations about whether the rise of China will lead to the Chinese overturn of the international order. About the Belt and Road, there are basically two narratives. The one narrative is the power narrative, which basically says that the BRI is the game changer in the international power politics, and it will lead to the rise of China that will overturn the liberal international order, the US-led international order, and China will become a dominant power. And there's also another narrative which is mainly produced by Chinese scholars, especially by the Chinese government, scholars affiliated with the Chinese government. So the public goods narrative, which basically argues that China will deliver public goods. So as mentioned by some of the previous speakers, the BRI is a gift from China to the rest of the world. So China will provide public goods as the dominant power, as the new superpower. And both narratives indicate that the rise of China will bring change to international law, will make China a rule maker, a new rule maker. So China will produce a set of new rules to replace the rules, institutions, and procedures embodied in the current liberal international order. The theoretical assumption is because the rise of China represents the rise of the new power, so we have a power transition, we have a power shift in international relations and in geopolitics. And according to the conventional wisdom of international relations scholars, power shift will lead to change in international law. My argument in this paper is actually based on the investigation of the rhetoric, the discourse, the narratives, and the official reports, and as well as the empirical study of the practice of Chinese firms and both the Chinese government and the Chinese firms. So my conclusion is the BRI does not make China a new rule maker in the international order, and let alone any Chinese venture to overthrow the international order. And I advance three reasons to support my argument. One reason is if you look at China's historical engagement with the international order, China seeks to rise from within, and so this part actually make a lot of reference to Professor Wang Jiangyu's landmark piece on that issue. And the second argument is, if if you look at the firm level, right, the government-to-government approach, and also the firm level, China's government's approach to the BRI is something I call the partnership-based relational approach. It's more interested, the Chinese government is more interested in maintaining relations rather than creating rules. So it's less interested in rulemaking, does not very much care about rulemaking insofar as the BRI is concerned. And the third reason is if you look at to the extent China wishes to use rules and institutions and establish new rules and institutions, China tends to make use of existing rules rather than creating its own rules. There's actually almost no evidence that China has produced new rules which are inconsistent with the spirit, right, with the principle of the liberal international order today. Let me, methodologically, so given my interest in international law and international relations, so what I aim to do in this paper is to develop a kind of an interpretive analytical approach to understand the Chinese practice in the BRI. Let me go directly to the first reason, so China's historical engagement with the liberal international order. The theoretical assumption is number one, we are living in the age of the liberal international order. Many people would disagree with that, but this is one of the theoretical assumptions of this paper. The second assumption is the liberal international order does not prevent or does not rule out the possibility of power transition. So the argument is basically that you can have a new master in the old system, but the new master will maintain the same system. So it basically argues that it's likely China will definitely continue to pursue global dominance, regional and global dominance. China might become a new superpower in the system, but it's more likely that China will make use of the old rules, will continue to maintain the system rather than overturning the system. And this is in part supported by China's historical engagement with the liberal international order. So if we can look at China's participation in the WTO. So China joined the WTO, paid a huge price to join the WTO, and the contrary to the rhetoric, contrary to the criticism that China has not complied with its obligations in the WTO. China has failed to comply with WTO decisions. The facts are actually the contrary. So China is actually a very good performer in the WTO. China is actually a very good citizen in the WTO. So the WTO has never said that China is a violator of its rules. And the WTO actually gave China the WTO, the former director, Pascal Lamy, said that China's performance record is A+. So there's of course Chinese way of compliance, but the matter of the fact is China has revised its laws to make all its laws and rules WTO consistent, and China is also a very active participant in the WTO dispute settlement system. China has lost most of the cases. China has won very few cases, lost most of the cases, and in each and every case, after it lost the case, China revised its laws to bring its own rules and institutions and laws into conformity with the WTO. So the literature on China's performance in the WTO is very much characterized China as a system maintainer, and at best, China is a reform-minded internal challenger. But China is not a violator. China is not a challenger that wishes to overthrow the system. Actually, what is happening in the past years, ever since the trade war, China has become a force in the WTO to resist new change in the WTO rules. Actually, the traditional power players in the WTO, including the US, European Union, and Japan, especially the US, wants to bring fundamental changes, make fundamental changes to the WTO, to change the WTO to something which will be fundamentally different from what it is today. And China is actually strong. China is a very strong the opponent to that change. Actually, just yesterday, there was a joint statement issued by the trade ministers from the US, European Union, and Japan. They advance changes. For example, one of the proposed changes would be basically to change the current judicial system in the WTO from the two-level appellate system to the one-level panel system. And there are also other requirements such as to create some special rules for state-owned enterprises. So those Chinese positions. China publishes its own opinion, publishes its own report on how to reform the WTO. Its position is to maintain the status quo without much change. China is actually so the good or bad. It basically demonstrates that China is a maintainer of the status quo rather than a challenge. But with what we have discussed so far is the Chinese position, the Chinese position in the international economic order. How about the international political order? China does not subscribe to the liberal value of the international political order, especially those values concerning human rights. But China has not proposed alternative values. It's more a defender rather than a challenger in the international order. So that's my first argument. The second argument is we look at a more empirical level, look at the Chinese approach to the governance of the bilateral and regional and even global economic cooperation. And you will find that China's overall approach is more relational, something I characterize as partnership-based relational approach. This is actually a very interesting approach. It does not challenge international law and does not pose a threat to the international order, but it might undermine the value of international law. This is how it works. So in China's government, in government-to-government approach, so basically the Chinese government pursues a partnership means that everything has to be based on consensus at the bilateral level. You have to agree, I have to agree, so we have to be happy about it. And relational approach basically means that China is more interested in maintaining long-term relations. So whether this project, so legality is not relevant, right? So if one party decides to change the terms and conditions of the contract, and one party even want to withdraw from it and to cancel it, after some deliberation, so many cases have shown that China is okay with it. Of course, if you compare this with the Western approach, so the Western approach is to impose an overall institutional umbrella, treaty-based international. You have an international organization, or at least you have a more formalized institutional structure, and you have rules. And institutions which across the board would apply to all the transactions. So each and every transaction has to comply with those rules. And a vivid example is the WTO. WTO has so far the largest body of rules and procedures. All the countries have to comply with the rules and procedures. Even one of the requirements of the WTO is that the individual countries, so two countries cannot contract out of those rules. You have to apply those rules. But the Chinese approach is the rules are not relevant. So as long as we are happy, we can apply any rules. And if needed, we can violate any rules. That one interesting example would be something discussed by the previous panelist speakers, that China's BRI projects in Malaysia. Based on what I know, Chinese government says when Mahathir canceled the project, the East Coast Rail project, at least the Chinese government did seriously consider the legal option, because some people in China believe that China at least have some contracts. This is a cancellation of contract, and if you analyze it from a pure legal perspective, it's more. There's a larger possibility that a court based in London or in Singapore or even in Malaysia might rule against Malaysia, because there are actually more examples, right? More facts that Malaysia has violated those rules. So China did consider to pursue a legal option to sue the Malaysian government, and the alternative option is we continue with our relational-based approach. Right? So we have to look at long-term relationship with Malaysia, and this project does not work out, and there are future projects. So China might economically suffer something in this project, but Malaysia, either this government or the next government, will compensate for us. They will make up for us. Right? So eventually, the Chinese government decided to go with its traditional relational approach rather than the more westernized legal approach. And there's also another very interesting phenomenon in the overall Chinese approach. So China basically pursues the one country, one approach, a model. That's one country, one approach model. So it depends on the wish, depends on the requirement of the other party. So the one country, one approach basically means in China's dealing with the UK, right? China is trying very hard to lure the UK into the BRI or the Western countries. So if you want to rule of law, so in our transactions, we will have transparency, we have accountability, and we will have very formalized dispute settlement system, and we will have everything based on the rule of law. So as long as you want it. Right? But in China, so this is one country, one approach, let's say with the UK, or probably even with Italy. Right? So but with a smaller developing country, which does not have a domestic rule of law, then let's go relational, right? Let's go bilateral, let's go relational, let's forget about law. So you have one approach with one country, with each individual country. So that is I will put it in 1 minute. So the third reason is my investigation, my study of the China's use of rules. To the extent China has to use some rules and institutions to establish more westernized global economic institutions. China uses existing rules and institutions. So I use two examples in my paper. One is the AIIB, the other is the China International Commercial Court. So the AIIB asserts that it has better corporate governance standards than other multilateral development institutions. Right? So the AIIB, one key difference, something alluded to by Selena, the AIIB does not impose conditionalities, right? Does not impose political conditionalities. But many multilateral, you do have very light conditionalities in multilateral development banks. So like the World Bank also does not impose many political conditionalities. The IMF does that, but the development agencies do not do that. Right? So China do not use the existing. So the very careful study of those institutions, there's no example that China has created a unique body of rules. They all make use of existing rules. Very, very quickly, concluding as part of the concluding remarks and future research agenda, will China become an international rule maker in the future? So so far, my discussion, my research is only about the past and the present. So in the future, will China become an international rule maker? We don't rule out that possibility, but there are two conditions which constrain China's future prospect as an international rule maker. Number one is the democracy, which sounds like a bit controversial, but I believe this because there are many international relations scholars in this room. In the scholarship of international relations, there's the theory called credible commitment. So the study of it's basically established wisdom in international relations scholarship that the democracies can make more credible commitments as perceived by the international society. So basically, the international society is more willing to accept rules and norms made by democracies. Right? And China is not yet a democracy. So the power, being powerful enough, does not give you the reputation and the credibility to make commitments to accept by others. And the second is rule of law. So this is also a very interesting theoretical question. If the country does not have true belief, sincere belief in rule of law domestically, can it become an international rule maker at the international level? I don't have conclusion to these two questions, but this is something, I guess this is something that can bring international law and domestic public law together. So thank you very much, that's all.
Dr. Chang for the opportunity. We came as a team, so I will do the first part and will leave the floor to my colleagues. The region we study, the Middle East, or more broadly West Asia, sits in between Europe and Asia. And in the past, it was through this middle chunk that the West went east, and in the process got embroiled as well as created many conflicts and rivalries in the region. And that story is familiar to us as the history of colonization. Today, with Belt and Road Initiative, China is going west, and it is again through this middle chunk that we call the Middle East or West Asia. And the question is, will China do differently? That is to say, will China be able to sustain further its commercial partnerships without getting embroiled in the various age-old rivalries, political conflicts, and sectarian violence that seem to be rampant in the region. And to answer that question, actually, we need a fresh set of eyes to look at what is going on in the region, because the Middle East often comes on the news for things like regime change, boycott, war, sectarian violence, what have you, all of which suggests that there is no real sense of peace and order. But at MEI, with my two other colleagues, we look at things a little more differently. In the midst of all that chaos, what we see is an emerging order of sorts. Thank you. Emerging order of sorts that comes into full view on a scale that includes the Middle East, but certainly goes beyond it. And our observation rests on two key developments in the region. One of which is the deep dive in Turkish-American relations, which pushed the Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan to develop very strong ties with his neighbors, namely Iran and Russia. These three countries, the three presidents, who are strained by their failing relations with Washington, have now a lot of reason to tone down their mutual differences and to find basically much needed additional strength, economically, politically, and so on. And they may have diverging, these are the three countries, Russia, Iran, Turkey. And these three countries have diverging interests in the region. But by compromising with one another, as they do in the case of Syria, for example, they manage to have a collective say in the affairs of the Middle East. And we call this collective force the Northern Tier. The growing clout of this northerly force in the affairs of the Middle East have already triggered the Gulf countries in the south to build their own alliances. And that Southern Alliance came into view in full during the Qatar crisis, which is the other key development we observe, which revealed a strong partnership among the Emiratis, the Saudis, Egypt, and Israel. So these two rival lines of alliances, we argue, have a certain logic of their own, which explain why political leaders in the region today make a number of puzzling geopolitical moves that appear to be following a sectarian logic in one moment while defying it in the next. At a time when differences in religion, ideology, political system in the Middle East help very little in navigating its ever-changing political landscape, we're interested in testing this idea of a two-tiered Middle East, whether it can actually offer an alternative explanatory framework, and whether it can help us understand how China can avoid being embroiled in the age-old rivalries of the region. So last year we organized a conference, and the proceedings have been now out as in-house articles, and we are bringing them into a single volume as well. You can follow it on our website. What I will do in the rest of my time is to share some insights about the Northern Tier from that conference and the papers. The first is partial solutions. What we call the Northern Tier is not a Cold War-style alliance, which would require the full commitment of its partners. Rather, it's a very loose coalition of states that are keen to learn how to pursue their diverging agendas. Thank you. Without stepping on each other's toes. And the key to such a delicate dance is to proceed with partial solutions, one step at a time. So what is different about partial solutions? In contrast to the all-or-nothing approach, where high stakes can cause gridlock, partial solutions raise the prospect of agreement by reducing the stakes for all parties. And this Northern Tier dynamic that we observe is most visible in Central Asia, in the city of Astana, of all the places, where the foreign ministers of these countries have been regularly meeting to broker a peace in Syria. And they have been quite successful, actually. Their efforts have, for example, have been very effective in the Syrian province of Idlib, the last standing territory of the Syrian opposition, where a human disaster was prevented last minute thanks to an agreement, last minute deal, between the Russian president and the Turkish president, a decision to create a demilitarized zone in Idlib, a decision that was endorsed by Tehran as well. And this was just one of the many examples we observed. But the question is, how do these leaders manage to achieve these last-minute deals? And our answer is, we think that it has something to do with the style of their leadership, particularly in the case of Turkey and Russia, where the leaders' firm grip on domestic politics brings them confidence and agility in foreign relations, although it feels very suffocating in their home countries. And these strongmen embodying their own states can make unexpected U-turns, reach last-minute deals without any fear of major domestic backlash, precisely because they are strongmen leaders. And what underlies it all is a shared sense of common fate. Because these three states, yes, all strained by their failing relations with Washington, are also old imperial neighbors that have a long history of trade and cultural contact, which resulted in the interpenetration of various communities and societies across their borders. And today, these strongman leaders basically partner with these diasporic populations and make use of their cultural and economic ties to build bridges with states and societies beyond their domains. In other words, these countries share a common human infrastructure that enables these states to project soft power within the Northern Tier and beyond it. And all these dynamics are changing the political landscape and opening new economic opportunities in the region, drawing in other countries in between these states who have now a motivation to solve age-old problems, one of them being the Caspian Dispute, which has been resolved last year and which is a great example in the way of explaining the efficacy of strong leaders, partial solutions, and being all-time neighbors. The Caspian Dispute was a lesson because the 5 Caspian states around the lake agreed to postpone the thorny aspects of the disagreement and just focused on the low stake part of the dispute to be able to collectively resolve this dispute overall, and postponing the thorny issues to bilateral relations to be sorted out later, which enables them now to extract and market natural resources that have been locked up because of the dispute. So with these developments, we can expect a proliferation of energy routes that connect the northern tier to the big markets in both in Europe and East Asia. And so these two parts, these two markets, we call the two wings of the northern tier. And pipelines are only, of course, part of the story. As you can see, a growing network of highways, railways, dry ports are tightening this northern tier geography and placing it as a major beneficiary of China's BRI. It basically constitutes, to exaggerate it a little bit, a stretch of peace and order, which China take advantage of. Thank you very much.
So I will follow up from where my colleague Serkan left. So with the consolidation and expansion of what he calls the northern tier, and the thinning US regional security cover in the Middle East, the small Persian Gulf oil-rich states like UAE felt that they would be swamped up by their bigger, more powerful regional neighbors like Iran. And they realized that since America is drawing down its military presence, they need to come up with a new geopolitical arrangement. When I say that America is drawing down its military presence, there are some caveats here. I will return to that, at the end of the presentation. So they felt that they had to come up with a new geopolitical security arrangement in the Middle East and extending beyond. This new geopolitical arrangement is called the Southern Tier. The center of gravity of the Southern Tier is basically the portion highlighted in red. It includes the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Israel. And then it has two flanks. The Southern Tier basically has two flanks stretching out to South Asia and East Africa. Now, one of the questions is, how can a small state like Abu Dhabi with the UAE with Abu Dhabi in the lead come up with this imagination of a geopolitical security architecture and look out to South Asia and East Africa? And for that, we need to understand these small resource-rich client states of the US as basically partial societies. And by partial societies, we mean that these societies always relied on their neighbors, South Asia and Africa, for their labor requirements, for basically their human resource requirements, and for food, raw materials, for all kinds of essentials that were required to sustain them. And this goes back long ago in history. And at some point, they were able to kind of use this to kind of scale up their alliances on a state-to-state basis. So basically, society started this initiative as a people-to-people initiative, and then when they realized that America was no longer the trusted ally that it used to be earlier, it decided to use those society-to-society alliances to build up and scale alliances with South Asia and East Africa. And those alliances exist basically in the form of ports, strategic locations, and naval bases across this stretch. So I leave it to my colleague Ameem, who will elaborate on that.
An example of what Nisha was talking about, the rise of UAE and expansion in this unique example of a non-traditional military power expanding abroad. And you can see it's sort of building up, taking up a lot of ports. It's in not just in its own region, but also in East Africa, where coincidentally it's coming to heads with China as well. And let me just point out the key development. So it brought out a commercial port, started off as a purely commercial venture. That expanded into, when it realized that the US is leaving, into developing its own military base for both the protection or anti-piracy effort, but also its war in Yemen. But the problem was that UAE, being a non-traditional military power that does not have its own strong military, did not have the resources itself, so it outsourced even its military itself. And it got soldiers from these other countries, which built very strong state-to-state ties between UAE and these other places in South Asia and East Africa. And also with non-traditional allies like Israel, which one would think is an enemy of sort of strong, historically Salafi Sunni states. But now they're both working together in this capacity, as well as commercial and strategic partnership with India, again a non-traditional ally for a very firmly Muslim state. And lastly, competition and collaboration with China. And let me just sort of talk about that point a little in detail and what this means for us in terms of China. Firstly, it allows us to move beyond a Western geography. So when China is expanding, it does not need to imagine these regions in the same cartographic of Southeast Asia, South Asia, East Africa. Instead, it can cut the geography in very different ways. In fact, not only it can cut it, but it's already happening. And if China starts to imagine it in these different cuts, it will somehow be closer to the reality. And secondly, horizontal inter-Asian connection. What it can do is that instead of trying to make deals and trying to make arrangement with each country separately, you can somehow try to imagine this geography in a larger whole, in larger regional imagination. That's neither taking on the traditional Western geographical constructs, nor reducing it to each state on its own, but a different kind of a different geographical imagination. And lastly, potential collaboration. This is mostly in terms of what for this networking event, is that our geography, it's a very broad cut, and we don't have a lot of pieces of the puzzle, so we need to work with other people who know some of these geographies better to see if this makes sense, if cutting the Middle East in this way does really provide a more a more productive map for China to imagine. Thank you.
So, who'd like to start?
I have a small question for Professor Wang. Could you explain a bit more about what do you mean by international rules? Because it seems to me a very general concept, like are there different dimensions of international rules, economically, financially? Because the cases you gave are mainly financial, economic, trade rules, so it's just a clarification.
A question for second April co-authors. We're talking about BRI, so actually the question is what can we tell about BRI's impact in the Middle East? Is there any prospect, any future of BRI and China's role in the Middle East? Thanks.
Sorry, I have a question for Professor Wang. So right now, it seems that the world economy has become has more uncertainty right now with the heating wave between China and US trade war. And it seems that neither of the two superpowers has respect the WTO rules or the international laws. So under this circumstance, how can or how should the international law to play its role regarding China's BRI? Thank you.
To build on it, there's this discussion about the clash of civilization and ideology. So what sort of impact does it have on the role of international order and international law? especially in terms of when working with other nations with different ideology along the Belt and Road, and also for the Middle Eastern countries, would there be a different set of ideological and civilization considerations as opposed to the Western versus Chinese? Yeah, so this is for all the speakers. Thank you.
So I'm just going to throw something in because it follows off from the earlier question. This is actually for Jiangyu as well, which is you lay out two possibilities, right? One that China, the sets of international rules, they get to stay, the other one gets broken. But there is, you allude to it, but you don't really delve into it, which is there's a possibility where there's erosion over time, and you get a situation where no rules stick, right? That there's a shell of some rules. So I'm really thinking about the period from the 1920s to 1930s. Why you get this collapse is because no one is stepping up as a upholder of the law. That's certainly a possibility that you don't really talk about so much. So please.
Okay, so let me start with the first question, Professor Gao's question, my definition of international law. So my definition is just the conventional, the mainstream definition of international law, which is basically the system of international law established by or the American-led international, the establishment of international law. So we have international rules which safeguard international peace and security, basically centered around the UN. And then we also have rules of international economic law under the umbrella of the Bretton Woods institutions, including including the GATT, WTO, IMF, and World Bank. So they all belong to the same integrated system of international law. You are definitely right that the examples I give in my paper are mainly related to international economic law, to financial and economic examples. As I mentioned in my paper, China is probably a very good global citizen in terms of complying with international economic law. China does not subscribe, and China almost fully subscribe to the values embodied in the international economic system and international economic law. China does not very much buy the political values, the liberal values in the international political order, such as human rights. So a liberal interpretation of human rights and self-determination and a number of other issues. But in this regard, China is mainly a defender rather than a challenger, because even though China resists those liberal values, but it's very much a domestic maneuver, right? So to basically explain to domestic constituencies, and it's also very much a maneuver to resist the Western interference of Chinese domestic affairs. For those values at the international level, China does not advance its own values. China has not developed a different system of political values like what the Soviet Union did. So this is my definition. That's why I don't very much mention the examples concerning political issues. Well, there are some examples such as the responsibility to protect R2P, humanitarian intervention. But China, likewise, China is not a very active participant in the discourse. So that's the first question. What's the second question? The Xiaoling's question. You said the U.S.-China trade war. I agree with you. It's also a bit linked to Yan's question about the relevance of international law. Very unfortunately, we are moving into a lawless period, very much like the situation in the 30 years before the First World War, before those chaotic period. So all the major powers pursue their national interest, pursue their desire for domination at the expense of international law. So we can see that the US, in the area of international economic law, in the area of WTO, the United States is becoming the biggest violator. What the US has been doing is to destroy the very foundation of the international economic system. So the United States has single-handedly destabilized and marginalized the WTO. So WTO is becoming useless. It's becoming useless because WTO now has only, the appellate body now has only 3 members. It has only 3 members. And by the end of this year, there will be only 1 member in at the appellate body. That will be the Chinese judge, Zhao Hong. And then therefore, any case to be tried, you need at least 3 members. And why the appellate body only has so many, it's not because that countries, WTO does not want to appoint new members, it's only because the US block each and every appointment. They block each and every appointment. So the US has successfully marginalized and destabilized the WTO. China is not such a violator, is not such a destroyer. But the American allegation is China comply with the letter, the black letter law, but China does not comply with the spirit of the WTO. So China revises its own laws, right? Because the WTO, the American argument is that the WTO is inadequate to address the new issues such as state-owned enterprises. The WTO is very much an ownership-neutral institution. WTO does not care whether you are a state-owned enterprise or you are a privately owned enterprise, as long as you conduct free trade. And the free trade basically means non-discrimination, right? So you reduce trade barriers to the minimum. So the lower the tariff, the lower the tariff barrier, that's fine. So the WTO does not care the ownership nature, the nature of the ownership of the actor, of the players in the system. Right? So the WTO has been marginalized. What the US and China, if we accept the conclusion that the US has violated the law itself and China has violated the spirit of the law, then one can argue that the international law, because of the behavior of these 2 powers, international law is becoming increasingly irrelevant. This is the very sad reality of our world today. I guess this partially addresses Yan's question. Those who have the responsibility to safeguard, to protect the international legal system, they no longer do it, and they become violators of international law. So I guess that's all I would have to answer. Thanks.
To answer your question, Professor, when we developed this model of the 2 tiers in the Middle East, it was basically to try and understand how sectarian ideologies, the Sunni-Shia divide, does not really explain what is going on right now in the Middle East. But in the process, we discovered that it has lots of analytic possibilities, and it can offer a blueprint for China to work with in terms of which regions to avoid doing business in, which partnerships to form, how to distribute risks. So there are clearly red lines in the Middle East that China should mind when it is investing in the Middle East. For instance, if you look at the Persian Gulf and the Straits of Hormuz, we know that even when the US slapped sanctions on Iran, China, India, Japan, and a couple of countries were given waivers, and Iran could export oil to them for 8 months, but now that it has stopped. One of the reasons cited for Iran and the US to come to heads is that Iran continued smuggling oil through the straits to we don't know who, and we can't say for sure who, but there is suspicion that it could be Japan, India, China, etc. And players like Abu Dhabi are importing Israeli technology to monitor and survey these regions. And this might get not just Iran, but also China into a knot with some of these countries. On the other hand, there are huge trade-offs that China can make, because if the US does not want to have more troops in the Middle East, the UAE and other players can always say, see, we're going to ask China for help. So they can also use China as a pressure tactic against the US to have more troops or to do their bidding. So in some ways, China can take advantage of it too. In the context of the US-China Cold War, the tech Cold War as it's now being called, there are places like Dubai where, where it's completely open for the Chinese to kind of reinstall some of their headquarters, like corporate headquarters, and they have, basically the UAE has money, so it can help. I know China doesn't need money, but there are ways in which they can collaborate in research, development, etc. So there are clearly these trade-offs that China should mind and can take advantage of, and how these small players can also benefit from. So that was mostly the extension of the two-tier argument that we are trying to make with respect to China.
About a question about ideology. When you think of like Middle East, you think of East versus West, Muslim ideology versus the classic Huntington clash of civilization. But I think what would be more important ideological sort of foundations for China to understand is that a lot of these countries are very used to dealing with an outside power. The way it's not, and we've talked about sort of like colonialism, resistance to colonialism, but people also know how to make it work for them. People know how to make colonialism work for them. So, which means that, and we've kind of seen this already, that China is trying to emphasize, look, there's not a colonial relationship, there's not a vertical relation, there's a very equal partnership relationship. There's a contract, you do this, and I'll do this instead. But when you go to these countries, these are countries that are used to a more vertical relationship with outside powers. They're more used to an outside power coming in and solving internal disputes, coming in and then doing social upheaval in various different kinds. China is resisting that until now. Until now, I mean, the one area that I'm familiar with in its port project in Gwadar, where its only investment has been in a local school. And actually, the people over there are constantly going to the Chinese authorities with various domestic issues and asking them to solve it. And they're like, no, we're not your colonial supervisor, we're just partners. So the ideological foundation from which they're working is very different. And in some ways, China has to contend with that. In the long run, it has to maybe even take on some of those roles and not see it sort of like, like being called a colonial power as necessarily something that's detrimental or evil, but just a very grammar by which power works in these areas.
Quick addition. One way in which China can manage its assets in the Middle East or in broader West Asia is to maybe take this two-tiered Middle East framework seriously, which is to say that if this holds, then no matter what happens within those tiers, in terms of small disagreements, conflict here and there, the states will do everything that they can to make sure that they don't escalate, scale up to a level of a huge war or a sort of an entrenched conflict that embroil many states. There is no guarantee of that between the tiers. So something like that in the frontier of the two tiers can erupt, but within those tiers, it's very unlikely that these states will allow a small conflict or a number of grievances to be aggregated into a bigger major conflict that would then threaten, say, commercial partnerships that China builds. So one thing China can do is to streamline its commercial investments along these two tiers, separately, don't mix them up. Don't get investment from a number of companies that are doing business in all countries. So make sure that, for example, your investment in Turkey has some partnership from Russia, say, or Iran, or it's getting gas, oil from the Caspian, etc., but don't really have some opening to, say, the Emirati money or resources, etc., etc.
Any other questions from the floor? Oh, yes, please.
Just add something to it. I believe there is also a question about the clash of civilizations. This is something that worries me very much because the discourse of clash of civilization, if it become kind of the mainstream discussion, it will definitely fragment international law. It will divide the international society. It will lead to a situation that international law, the current international law, is your law, not our law. So the Chinese will see we create our law, and we will go back to our own old maybe tributary system, whatever system. So now the international law today is your law, because we had international law in the early years of international law. There was a very famous doctrine which is part of the mainstream of international law. It's the doctrine of standard of civilization. So the Western imperialist, colonialist didn't want to afford protection to the people in the colonies. Right? Didn't want to give them protection under international law, based on the argument that those are not civilizations, right? They are not up to the standard of civilization. So we have international law which protect human rights and which treat human as human, but those people in Asia, in Latin America, in Africa, they are not human civilizations. They do not deserve. Which was, it sounds like a black joke, but it was the formal doctrine of international law. The formal doctrine standard of civilization. So I'm very much afraid the debate about this clash of civilization will bring us to the old, bad, dark days in a different form. So the Chinese, because the clash of civilization debate, it was mentioned first advanced by, in all this, in the past year, advanced by Skinner, by American senior official, and it was also mentioned by the Chinese President Xi Jinping. Right? So it's becoming very serious.
Yeah, I add to that because it's one of these tensions that the BRI brings out. Because one of the things about international law, right, is that there's an assumption of universality of values, universality of, so we all sort of subscribe to the same basic principles. But once you have things, this is where the tension is. Once you have things like Asian values are exceptional, Asia for the Asians, or that there's some Western standard, that actually suggests that there are values that are not universal, and so then it's very hard to apply a set of universal rules, standards, practices. And that's a tension that I think it's been articulated, I think, very recently, but it's been a tension that's been around, floating in the background for quite a bit.
Yeah, sure. So those are dangerous signs. So the discussion about the value of international law within China suggests such kind of dangerous sign, because the discussion is very, very much divided. On the one hand, official rhetoric in China does recognize the universality of international law. On the other hand, you have a lot of voices in China, from China, which try to link Asian values, Chinese values, to international law. So it's quite divided, but those are very dangerous signs.
Sorry for that. Sorry, but are there any final notes? If not, then I suppose we should thank our panelists. I'll do a quick wrap up. Thank you all for your attention and bearing with me, but there's a great presentation. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so I know I've been sort of taxing on everyone's attention and energy today, so I'm really grateful that you've all come and stayed to the end. So what remains to be done is to talk about next steps, which I will lay out right now, but we don't have to sort of do that immediately, because I suppose people will probably appreciate a little bit of time to think about things. So as I said in the beginning, the idea here is to understand what different people are doing around around both NUS and also institutions around Singapore, so that we can find points for collaboration. And I suppose that's what I've tried to do today, and I think with all your help it's been quite successful. So the next step would be, okay, so how do we want to take this forward in terms of putting together a larger social science research thematic grant. So there, I know that some of you sitting here may think, okay, well, I'm actually really interested, I want to be part of this. Others may say, well, this is not really for me, that's all fine. But for those of you who are interested, Gaujie is like, this is Ian's a waste of time as usual.
No, it's from chemistry.
Oh, okay. So at any rate, what lies for us to do then is those of you who are interested in perhaps trying to put something together, we have Pravina at the back. You could perhaps leave your contact with her, or you can take her name card, which is outside, and she will collect the names and contact of those of you who are interested, and then we can think about getting together in a more compact fashion to then decide how we want to move ahead, how we want to do different carve-outs. Because when it comes to the grant writing, what will happen is we need to have the same basic idea, and from there we have to sort of do some division of labor. So that's the sort of next step. And so for the logistics stuff, I will put them in sort of very trustworthy and reliable hands of Pravina. So that's really the next step. Otherwise, I won't hold you guys back anymore. I'm very grateful that you're here again, and I hope that we managed to spark off some useful conversations today. All right, thank you.